Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be exploring the idea of compassion.
Okay.
It's a topic that at first you might think, oh, this is going to be easy peasy, but it's really a lot deeper than you might initially think.
Right.
So our source material today is Karen Armstrong's audiobook, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life.
Okay.
But don't worry, we are not going to be, getting into religious dogma or
Right.
anything like that.
It's really about kind of this universal human struggle
Yeah.
to cultivate compassion. And I think Armstrong approaches it from some pretty surprising angles.
It's true. I mean, we are going to learn about everything from the biological basis for compassion to ancient Greek tragedies,
Wow.
and even how rituals played a role in promoting compassion in ancient China.
That's a lot.
It's quite a mix.
Yeah.
Um, so where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, I think it all starts with a really fundamental question, which is what is compassion, really?
Right.
And Armstrong is very clear that it's not simply pity. I mean, even dictionaries will often define compassion as pitiable, which I find really interesting.
Why do you think that she's so insistent on making that distinction between compassion and pity?
Well, I think she sees pity as a more passive emotion,
Okay.
kind of a fleeting feeling of sorrow for someone else's misfortune,
Uh-huh.
whereas compassion is active.
Okay.
And she really emphasizes the etymology of the word.
Okay.
It comes from the Latin and Greek, meaning to suffer with.
Hmm.
So it's about stepping into another person's shoes,
Yeah.
truly understanding their pain,
Okay.
not just feeling sorry for them.
That makes the golden rule a lot more than just a nice saying, doesn't it?
Right.
I mean, it becomes a call to actively try to understand what causes pain for others,
Yeah,
so we can make a conscious choice to avoid inflicting it.
exactly. It's about consistently striving
Yeah.
to live in a way that minimizes harm.
And that brings up something that I think a lot of people struggle with, which is the fact that our brains aren't exactly wired for constant compassion.
Right.
And Armstrong highlights this paradox, that we're biologically driven towards both compassion and self-preservation.
Right.
We have this ancient fight or flight response
Yes.
that is constantly vying for our attention.
She talks about these drives as the 4 Fs:
Right.
feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction.
Yeah.
I mean, those are some powerful urges.
Absolutely. And I think the key here is recognizing that we're all dealing with these primal instincts.
Right.
It's not about judging ourselves or others for having them,
Yeah.
but rather understanding how they can sometimes override
Yeah.
our more compassionate impulses.
So I'm curious, how did people in ancient times think about this challenge?
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have the benefit of modern science to explain things like evolutionary psychology.
Right. Well, what's fascinating is that even without that scientific framework,
Okay. Ancient traditions, from Confucianism and Buddhism to Judaism and Christianity, were all grappling with these same fundamental questions about compassion.
it seems that every era has its own unique challenges
Yeah.
that force us to reconsider what it means to be compassionate.
Yeah.
It's almost like a universal theme throughout human history.
Totally. Think about ancient China during the Warring States period.
Okay.
They were facing rampant violence,
Yeah.
social upheaval.
Hmm.
How did thinkers like Confucius respond to that?
Right.
Or consider the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE
Uh-huh.
a truly devastating event?
Right.
How did that tragedy shape Jewish ideas about compassion?
It's incredible to think about how these historical events influenced
Right.
the development of ethical and spiritual ideas.
Yeah.
But what I find really empowering is that Armstrong emphasizes that compassion is a skill.
Yes.
It's something we can develop and strengthen over time.
It's not something we're simply born with or stuck with.
Right.
It's like physical or artistic abilities.
Huh.
You can train
Yeah.
and improve your capacity for compassion.
So what does that training look like?
Yeah.
I mean, does she give us like specific exercises to work these compassion muscles?
Her 12 steps provide a framework, a kind of mental workout routine.
Okay.
There's mindfulness, the practice of observing your own thoughts and reactions without judgment,
Okay.
and the power of ritual.
Ritual.
Yeah.
That seems a little unexpected in a book about compassion.
Well, Armstrong argues that rituals, when done with intention,
Okay.
can be powerful tools for cultivating empathy.
Okay.
She gives the example of ancient Chinese family rituals designed to cultivate respect and consideration for every member of the family.
It makes me wonder, what are the modern day equivalents of these rituals?
Yeah.
What are we doing or not doing in our daily lives that could be fostering or hindering our capacity for compassion?
It's a great question. I think a lot of our modern routines are actually designed to maximize efficiency and productivity.
Yeah.
often at the expense of connection and empathy.
So how do we break free from those patterns and move towards a more compassionate way of life?
Right.
Armstrong talks a lot about overcoming that me first mentality,
That's
right?
a key part of her argument.
Yeah.
She and the Dalai Lama both talk about the need for a spiritual revolution,
Okay.
a shift away from our obsession with ourselves and our own needs.
I think a lot of people hear that and get a little nervous. Like,
Yeah.
oh no, that sounds like self-hatred, but it's really more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Totally.
Right.
It's not about hating yourself,
Yeah.
but rather recognizing how this constant focus on me
Right.
can actually be the source of a lot of our suffering.
Okay.
And she points to the Buddhist idea of no self, which isn't about annihilation,
Right.
but rather a liberation from this limited, ego-driven view of ourselves.
So how do we start to move away from that self-centered perspective?
Yeah.
I mean, it can feel pretty ingrained, especially in today's world.
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Armstrong turns to some ancient Greek and Chinese wisdom to help us understand the importance of embracing the unknown.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
Yeah.
What do the ancient Greeks have to do with all of this?
Think about Socrates and his famous quote about the unexamined life.
Mm-hmm.
It's a call to question our assumptions, to constantly be learning and growing.
Yeah.
And then there's the image of the frog in the well from the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay.
What's the frog in the well all about?
It's a story about a frog who lives at the bottom of a well and thinks that his limited view of the world is all there is.
Oh.
It's a metaphor for how clinging to certainty and our limited perspectives can actually prevent us from developing compassion.
So by embracing the unknown, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, we open ourselves up to new possibilities
Right.
and deeper understanding.
Exactly. It's about cultivating humility
Yeah.
and recognizing that there's always more to learn.
Yeah.
And that leads us to one of the most crucial aspects of compassion, empathy. We have to shift our focus outward,
Yeah.
away from our own little worlds,
Right.
and towards a deeper understanding of the suffering of others.
And Armstrong uses a really powerful example from the ancient Greeks to illustrate this point.
She talks about the concept of tragedy and catharsis
Okay.
in Greek theater.
Yeah.
You know, audiences would come together
Mm-hmm.
to experience these intense emotional stories,
Okay.
weeping together as a community. It
Wow.
was a shared experience
Yeah.
of grief and release.
So it wasn't just about passively observing someone else's suffering, but actually
Yeah.
feeling it with them,
Yeah,
connecting through that shared experience.
exactly. And that connects to the Tibetan notion of Ningje,
Okay.
a word that's often translated as compassion, but it carries a much deeper meaning.
Okay.
It literally means the inability to bear the sight of another person's pain.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just feeling sorry for someone. It's this visceral, almost physical aversion to seeing another being suffer.
Right.
And that visceral response, that deep sense of empathy, is what fuels compassionate action.
Right.
It's what motivates us to alleviate suffering wherever we see it.
So how do we move from that gut level feeling of empathy to actually communicating in a way that fosters compassion and understanding?
Right.
That can feel particularly challenging in today's world where it seems like everyone's just shouting their opinions at each other.
That's where things get really interesting. We have to think about how to cultivate compassionate communication.
Okay.
And Armstrong actually highlights the lack of true dialogue in our modern world.
She contrasts it with the Socratic method, where the goal is to arrive at a deeper understanding through thoughtful questioning and listening.
Right.
I think we could all benefit from a bit more of that these days.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, from the biological basis of compassion to ancient wisdom traditions to the power of empathy and the importance of compassionate communication.
Right.
But there's still so much to explore.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into those 12 steps and talk about specific practices and tools that we can use to cultivate compassion in our everyday lives.
Great.
So stay tuned. Welcome back. So we've established that compassion is more than just a feeling. It's a skill we can develop. But can it really make a difference in the world, especially in a society that often seems to prioritize self-interest and competition?
Yeah, I think Armstrong doesn't shy away from those tough questions.
Yeah.
She acknowledges that compassion can feel kind of at odds with certain aspects of our modern tech-driven world.
Right.
She even points to the ways in which capitalism itself can be seen as a system that often rewards individualistic competitive behavior.
It does make you wonder if we're constantly bombarded with messages that tell us to look out for, number one, how can we possibly cultivate a more compassionate society?
Right. Well, remember how we were talking about those historical periods
Yeah.
of intense social and spiritual upheaval?
Yeah.
Armstrong refers to this as the axial age,
Okay.
a time when many of the world's major religions and philosophical traditions emerged.
Okay.
It was a period marked by urbanization, rising violence, economic disparity.
So familiar.
Right.
It's amazing how certain patterns seem to repeat themselves throughout history.
And what's really inspiring is that during those turbulent times, thinkers didn't just despair.
Right.
They actively sought solutions.
Okay.
Think about the Buddha abandoning his privileged life to seek enlightenment.
Yeah.
The rabbis reinterpreting scripture in the wake of the destruction of the temple,
Right.
or the Chinese philosopher Mozi challenging traditional notions of family and loyalty in favor of universal love.
It's a reminder that even in the face of immense challenges, there's always the possibility for radical change and innovation. But where do we even begin?
Well, Armstrong emphasizes that it all starts with ourselves. Remember Gandhi's famous quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world?" We can't expect to create a more compassionate society if we haven't done the work to cultivate compassion within ourselves.
So how do we actually cultivate that inner compassion? Armstrong's 12 steps seem to offer a practical roadmap.
She even compares it to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay.
It's a process of recognizing our own patterns of self-centeredness, working to break free from those patterns, and ultimately finding a more fulfilling way of life.
And that first step, learn about compassion, seems deceptively simple, but it's more than just intellectually grasping the concept.
Right. It's about engaging with it on a deeper level.
Okay.
And this is where those ancient wisdom traditions can be so helpful.
Okay.
They provide the inspiration, the myths, and the stories that can help us connect with compassion on a heart level, not just a head level.
It's like those stories can bypass our logical minds and speak directly to something deeper within us.
Exactly. And the Charter for Compassion is a great modern example.
Yeah.
It's a collaborative effort from diverse faith traditions to highlight the universality of the compassionate ideal. It's a wonderful resource for anyone wanting to explore further.
But Armstrong reminds us that knowledge alone isn't enough. We have to put it into practice.
Right. That's where the second step comes in.
Okay.
Look at your own world.
Okay.
It's a call to action to step outside of our comfort zones and really see the world around us with fresh eyes.
It's like climbing a mountain to get a broader perspective.
Right.
We need to step back from our own limited viewpoints and see the bigger picture.
And Armstrong challenges us to start with the most immediate circles.
Okay.
Our families, our workplaces, our communities, and ultimately our nations.
Okay.
She asks some tough questions
Okay.
about how we treat the elderly, how businesses prioritize profit over people, and how we deal with conflict and difference.
It makes me think about those Confucian ideals of ritual and respect. How can we adapt those ancient principles to our modern lives?
It's about consciously creating a culture of compassion, not just on a global scale, but within our own homes and communities.
Okay.
But here's the catch. You can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
Before we can extend compassion outward, we have to cultivate it inward.
This brings us to one of the trickiest steps to say, have compassion for yourself.
Right.
I think a lot of people, myself included, stumble here.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in self-criticism.
That's why this step is so crucial.
Okay.
Armstrong is adamant that we can't truly love others if we don't love ourselves.
Okay.
And she doesn't shy away from acknowledging the systemic factors that can make self-love so difficult.
She talks about how colonialism, for example, has had a lasting impact on self-worth, particularly for people from marginalized communities.
Right. It's a reminder that compassion isn't just about individual feelings.
Yeah.
It's shaped by history, by power dynamics, by societal forces.
But on a more personal level, how do we actually cultivate that sense of self-compassion?
Armstrong suggests something very practical. Make a list of your good qualities.
Okay.
It sounds simple, but it can be a powerful way to counteract those negative self-talk patterns.
It's like giving ourselves permission to acknowledge our own strengths and celebrate the good within ourselves.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all works in progress.
Yeah.
We have flaws, but those flaws don't negate our inherent worthiness of love and compassion.
This reminds me of that Buddhist teaching about detaching from the ego, that this is not mine, this is not me approach to negative thoughts and emotions.
Right. It's about understanding that those thoughts and emotions are part of our human experience.
Right.
but they don't define us.
Yeah.
And that includes acknowledging our own pain.
Okay.
Armstrong actually says that making space for suffering, both our own and that of others, is essential for developing empathy.
It makes sense when you think about it. It's those shared experiences of vulnerability and pain that connect us on a human level.
Right. It's like that Greek idea of tragedy and catharsis.
Yeah.
It's allowing ourselves to feel those deep emotions, to weep together, to find solace in shared experience.
And that Tibetan notion of nyingje really drives that home.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of being unable to turn away from suffering even when it's uncomfortable.
Right. It's a call to active empathy,
Yeah.
to being present with another person's pain without trying to fix it or explain it away.
Okay.
But how do we cultivate this kind of empathy? How do we open ourselves up to the suffering of others without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down?
This is where Armstrong brings in a concept that's both simple and profound. Mindfulness.
Yes.
It's about paying attention to the present moment, to our thoughts, feelings, and sensations without judgment.
Right. It's not about escaping reality,
Right.
but about being fully present in it.
Yeah.
She even compares it to a mental gym,
Okay.
training our minds to be more aware, more compassionate, and more responsive to the needs of others.
I like that analogy. But how does mindfulness actually help us become more compassionate?
Well, it starts with understanding how our minds work. Okay, remember those 4 Fs we were talking about?
Yes.
Mindfulness helps us recognize those primal instincts when they pop up and gives us the space to choose a more compassionate response instead of simply reacting.
So it's about creating that pause between stimulus and response.
Right.
That moment where we have the choice to act out of compassion rather than fear or anger.
Exactly. And mindfulness helps us to create that space.
Yeah.
It's about observing those negative thoughts and emotions without judgment, recognizing them as part of our evolutionary wiring, but not letting them control us.
She emphasizes that it's a process,
Yeah.
that it takes time and practice.
Absolutely.
There's no quick fix to becoming a more compassionate person.
But the rewards are immense. As we develop mindfulness, we start to see ourselves and others more clearly.
Huh.
We become less reactive, less judgmental, more understanding.
And that's where the real magic happens. When we can approach ourselves and others with that kind of awareness, those compassionate actions start to flow naturally.
Armstrong gives us some concrete practices to help us integrate mindfulness into our daily lives.
Okay.
She talks about committing to 3 actions each day. 1 positive action in line with the golden rule, 1 act of restraint from causing harm, and 1 intentional shift in our thought patterns.
It's like a daily compassion workout. It reminds me of that Confucian idea of practicing those rituals of respect and consideration every single day.
It's about building those habits, those compassionate reflexes, until they become second nature.
Okay.
But as we delve deeper into this practice of compassion, we inevitably come up against the limits of our own knowledge.
Uh-huh.
We realize how much we don't know about ourselves, about others, about the world.
This is where that 7th step comes in, recognizing how little we know. It's a call to humility, to intellectual honesty.
She uses the example of a religious historian,
Okay.
someone who has to step outside their own perspective and truly understand a worldview that might be vastly different from their own.
It's about making space for the other, recognizing the inherent mystery of each individual, each culture, each tradition.
It's like that Socratic idea of questioning everything,
Right.
especially our own cherished beliefs.
Okay.
It's about embracing uncertainty.
And Armstrong contrasts this with the overconfidence and dogmatism that seems so prevalent in our world today.
Right.
Do we really know what we're talking about, or are we just clinging to our opinions out of fear and ego?
Right. It's a challenge to be more intellectually rigorous,
Okay.
more open to different perspectives.
Yeah.
It's about being willing to say, I don't know.
That can feel really vulnerable,
Yeah.
especially in a culture that often rewards certainty and strong opinions.
But it's also incredibly liberating. When we let go of that need to be right, all the time we open ourselves up to a world of possibility. And this leads to a fascinating point that Armstrong brings up. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know.
Right.
It's that sense of awe and wonder that Einstein talked about.
It reminds me of that feeling you get when you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon.
Right.
You're just overwhelmed by the vastness and complexity of it all.
And that same sense of awe and wonder can be applied to the human experience.
Yeah.
Each person is a universe unto themselves, filled with depths and complexities that we can never fully comprehend.
It's about approaching each encounter with a sense of reverence, recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual.
Think about those Hindu traditions of greeting each other with joined hands, acknowledging the divine spark within each person.
That's a beautiful image. But how do we translate that into our everyday lives? How do we cultivate that sense of wonder and reverence in a world that's often so focused on the superficial?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Hmm.
And it starts with acknowledging our own limitations.
Okay.
We have to be willing to let go of the need to be right, to control, to explain everything.
It's about being open to the mystery, to the possibility that there's more to life than we can ever fully grasp.
It can feel humbling,
Yeah.
but it's also incredibly freeing.
Yeah.
When we release that grip on certainty, we open ourselves up to a world of possibility.
So how do we move from this intellectual understanding to an embodied practice?
Yeah.
What does it look like to live with that sense of awe and wonder in our interactions with others?
That's the question we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll delve into specific practices, those tools and techniques that can help us cultivate compassion in our everyday lives.
I'm really looking forward to getting into those specifics. This is where things start to get really practical.
Yeah.
But for now, we'll leave you with that image of the vastness of the Grand Canyon
Right.
and the equally vast and mysterious inner landscape of each human being.
Welcome back to our deep dive into compassion.
Mm.
We've explored some really profound ideas, but now it's time to get practical. How do we actually put these concepts into action in our daily lives?
Well, I think Armstrong is very clear that compassion isn't just about having good intentions or warm feelings. It's about embodied action.
She calls us to find our own unique path of service, a way of contributing to the well-being of others that resonates with our individual skills and passions.
That's encouraging. It means we can all make a difference regardless of our circumstances or abilities. But before we jump into those outward actions, I think Armstrong emphasizes something really important: communication.
Absolutely. Remember our earlier discussion about the lack of true Socratic dialogue in our modern world?
Yeah.
She believes compassionate communication is one of the most powerful tools we have for creating a more caring and understanding society.
Okay, but being a better listener can sound a bit vague.
Right.
What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, Armstrong suggests focusing on mindful speech.
Oh.
It's about being aware of the impact our words have on others, choosing kindness and understanding over harshness and judgment.
It's like those Confucian rituals of respect we talked about, but applied to our everyday conversations.
Exactly.
Those small intentional acts of consideration can really create a more harmonious environment. But what about when we're faced with conflict or difficult people?
Yeah. That's where those ancient teachings on forgiveness and loving your enemies come into play.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that even those who cause us pain are still driven by those same basic human needs.
Okay.
The 4 F's we discussed earlier.
Right.
Fear, desire, the need for security.
Loving your enemies sounds like a tall order, especially when someone has really hurt you.
Right.
It feels almost counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Don't we have a right to be angry?
Well, remember the Buddhist teachings on detachment and non-attachment.
Yes.
It's not about condoning harmful actions,
All right.
but rather recognizing that holding on to anger and resentment ultimately causes more suffering.
Okay.
For ourselves and others, it's about choosing to break free from that cycle of pain.
So it's not about suppressing our feelings, but about transforming them, finding a way to move beyond that initial reaction of anger or hurt towards something more constructive.
Yeah, it's a radical shift in perspective.
Okay.
Instead of seeing those who harm us as separate and threatening, we start to see them as mirrors,
Okay.
reflecting back those same primal instincts that we all struggle with.
That's a powerful image. It reminds me of that sense of interconnectedness that we talked about earlier.
Right.
Recognizing that we're all part of this web of humanity sharing this journey together.
And one of the most powerful practices for cultivating this kind of compassion is loving kindness meditation, sometimes called metta meditation.
I've heard about that, but I'll be honest, I've always struggled with meditation.
Yeah.
My mind just races. Is this different from other types of meditation?
Well, it's about intentionally cultivating a feeling of loving kindness
Yeah.
and directing it outward.
Okay.
First to ourselves, then to loved ones, then to neutral people, then to difficult people, and finally to all beings.
That's quite a progression. It sounds like it could be incredibly transformative, but also quite challenging.
It does take practice, patience,
Mm.
and a willingness to be gentle with ourselves.
Yeah.
Remember, even the Buddha struggled.
Yeah.
But Armstrong emphasizes that even a few minutes a day can make a difference.
So it's not about achieving some perfect state of bliss or emptying our minds of all thoughts. It's about showing up consistently, even if it's just for a few moments at a time, and gently guiding our attention towards that feeling of loving kindness.
Exactly. And as we cultivate that feeling, it starts to spill over into our everyday lives.
Okay.
We become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, not just towards others, but also towards ourselves.
That's the real key, isn't it? Extending that same compassion that we're cultivating for others inward towards our own imperfections and struggles.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the idea of embodied action.
Okay.
Armstrong reminds us that compassion isn't just about how we feel, it's about how we act in the world.
She encourages us to find our own unique path of service, a way of contributing to the well-being of others that aligns with our individual gifts and passions.
Right. It could take so many different forms. It might be volunteering at a local soup kitchen, or mentoring a young person, or simply being a more present and supportive friend or family member.
It's about using whatever skills, talents, and resources we have to make a positive impact, however small or grand that impact might be.
And ultimately, I think that's what Armstrong's 12 steps are all about: a call to action, a roadmap to cultivating a more compassionate self, and by extension, a more compassionate world.
It's a lifelong journey,
Absolutely.
and it starts with each of us choosing to cultivate that seed of compassion within ourselves, nurturing it, and allowing it to blossom into action.
And as we practice compassion, we not only transform ourselves, but we also contribute to the collective healing and transformation of our communities and the world around us.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with this question. What is one small action you can take today to cultivate a bit more compassion in your own life?
Yeah.
It might be a simple act of kindness, a moment of mindful listening, or a few minutes of loving kindness meditation.
Remember, every act of compassion, no matter how small, ripples outward, creating a more loving and interconnected world.
This deep dive has just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of wisdom and practice waiting to be explored.
Keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep practicing compassion.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into compassion. We hope it's inspired you to cultivate a little more kindness and understanding in your own life and in the world around you.